During the classical years of the Heian period, before the outbreak of the Gempei War and the eventual rise of the Kamakura shogunate, there arrived in Kyoto a warrior of peerless might. He was a monk, but also a large and intimidating figure, one who would come to be known widely as an indomitable combatant. He was also a well-traveled individual, who although supposedly had been raised in Kyoto, had made his way across the land, all while earning a reputation as wild and unpredictable. His name was Saitō Mussashi-bō Benkei. At some point, he had decided to return to the capital, having taken up an ambitious quest to defeat and take the swords of 1,000 unworthy samurai within the city. One by one, through instigating duels and striking at those he deemed fit, he bested scores of warriors, until at last he had claimed 999 blades. But he would never receive his 1,000th, for the final samurai he chose to face was one who countered his every move. He was young, handsome, and agile, a figure he had never seen the likes of before. Benkei battled with this man for some time, supposedly at the Gojo Ohashi Bridge, until finally the swiftness of his movements bested him. At last, Benkei had met his match. The man he had fought turned out to be Minamoto no Yoshitsune, son of the significant Lord Yoshitomo. And although stories say he would try a second time to get revenge and finally see victory over his rival, Benkei would ultimately lose yet again. This time, however, seeing Yoshitsune as his better and as a warrior worthy of serving, Benkei would pledge himself to him. It is here the two would become a legendary pair who would fight side by side until the very end. Much of what we think we know about the figure that was Saitō Musashibo Benkei is shrouded in a mythical aura. Although his great deeds are ones of tremendous ability and worthy of limitless renown, it is important to keep in mind that the legend of Benkei is at the end of the day just that, legend. We don't know if Benkei actually existed, and if he did, the stories we have of his amazing and often hard-to-believe accomplishments are ones which seem to have arisen centuries after he was supposed to have lived. So it is fair to assume that in all truth, Benkei might just have been a fictional character, a larger-than-life figure who would go on to inspire countless samurai, who would come to be captivated by tales of the strength and courage he was said to have exhibited. But today, what we are going to do is actually follow the fantastical story we have of Benkei's life, from his supposed origins to his valiant death, as we work to understand why Benkei was destined to become such a hero in the annals of Japanese history. It is not known when Benkei was born, but that instead some evidence points to it being in Tanabe, a town located in Ki Province. Besides that, much of the actual event of his birth is said to have been a spectacular affair. There are several ideas of how Benkei was conceived, with some being more tragic as an instance of rape, while other stories saying he was actually the child of a god. The latter feeds much more into the crazy telling of what supposedly happened next. It was said that for 18 months, twice the actual term of a normal pregnancy, Benkei's mother carried him within her womb, until finally he was born. He arrived as a massive child, with already a full head of hair and a mouth full of teeth. His father, a figure some believe to have been a holy man by the name of Kumano Beto Tanzo, upon seeing his child for the first time, was caught off guard in utter shock and disgust, believing Benkei to be a demon or ogre. Because of this, he attacked the child. Luckily, Benkei would survive the ordeal, and would instead be taken away to be supposedly raised by his aunt, perhaps in Kyoto. Obviously, however, Benkei's childhood would not be normal. Coming to be called Oniwaka, he was a mountain of a boy, perhaps seen as freakish by others, and also without the love and care of his birth parents. Eventually, he would develop a wild and rebellious nature. In time, to hopefully quell his rough demeanor, he was sent to Mount Hiei, where he was to take up the religious life of a Tendai Buddhist monk at the famed and historic Enrakuji Temple, the same one that Oda Nobunaga would destroy hundreds of years later. Yet, despite Benkei taking to the practice quite willingly and perhaps even eagerly, his wild behavior eventually started to get in the way of his actual religious lifestyle. Benkei would, throughout the years, prove too difficult to handle, and finally, this would lead to him being expelled from Enrakuji. Undeterred by this unfortunate turn of events, Benkei, who had likely now come into adulthood, set off into the world to continue his religious journey. It was also here where he would finally take up the famous name he would come to use for the rest of his life, ditching past names like Oniwaka to instead take up his new full name, Saitō Mussashi-bō Benkei, a name of great sentimental value to him because it combined elements of his lineage and upbringing. From here, he set off to travel the land while continuing to serve as a religious figure himself. This is where some stories point to Benkei becoming a Yamabushi, a wandering holy man and hermit who traversed the mountains and took up an ascetic lifestyle, swearing off all things of pleasure to achieve further enlightenment. However, it appears that things did not go totally to plan for Benkei, as he engaged in all sorts of chaotic actions, trying often to fulfill the role of a holy man, but also to some unfortunate results. He is even said to have caused an entire temple to burn down at one point. Yet he does all of this notably while also in good humor, never dwelling too seriously on the larger ramifications, but instead taking all things within stride. And eventually, his journeys led him back to Kyoto, now resembling much more the iconic figure we know him as, having grown up into a monstrous man, donning the traditional religious garb, yet also carrying an odd variety of weapons on his back. You see, it appears Benkei's wild nature had also given rise to a lust for combat. He enjoyed to fight, and his travels had surely stoked that flame, as he had likely come to encounter all sorts of challenges along his way. To this, we can see that besides his sword, he had acquired 7 specific weapons that he would come to use with deadly efficiency. These were a naginata, a tetsubo, and an axe, more normal weapons of warfare. However, he would also carry a mallet, a sickle, a rake, and even a saw. Obviously, he was well equipped to take down any enemy, and this is where he would finally, upon arriving in Kyoto, take up his seemingly impossible quest. His new goal was to claim 1,000 swords from unworthy or arrogant samurai by defeating them in combat. This is the story I told at the start, one which only furthered his legend, as he would come to best hundreds of samurai, a record that honestly puts any other record of samurai duelists to shame if this was actually true. For who could dare to defeat this monstrous monk, who not only had inhuman strength, but also the skill to back it all up? Well, as it turns out, only one figure had what it took to defeat Benkei, the final figure he would challenge. A young samurai who has often been described as almost feminine looking, a figure by the name of Minamoto no Yoshitsune. Yoshitsune was the son of Minamoto no Yoshitomo and the brother of the future shogun, Minamoto no Yoritomo, and he had lived a rather bizarre life up until that point for sure. Yoshitsune was born in 1159 and spent much of his early years living a rather sheltered lifestyle, following his father's defeat by the Taira in the Heiji Rebellion, which had occurred just 1 year after his birth. This had resulted in the majority of his family being sent into exile, while his father, Yoshitomo, would unfortunately later be assassinated. It would be many years before the Minamoto would get their revenge against the Taira. During this time, Yoshitsune, as a child, appears to have been able to remain in Kyoto, but in a rather confined role. Due to his position, it appears that he too was destined to eventually take up the religious life of a monk as well, but he would ultimately decide otherwise, eventually leaving that life behind once he had reached his teenage years, where he then set off to fine-tune his own martial prowess. It is likely that it was during this point in his life where he would come to encounter Benkei. All of the circumstances surrounding their duel are rather shrouded in a bit of mystery, as many of the fantastical aspects of it are largely ones which arose years later as part of romantic retellings of the event. For one is the sheer magnitude of such a tremendous feat of Benkei's quest, to have bested nearly 1,000 samurai. An undertaking so spectacular it obviously must be myth, but also the location of their initial meeting seems to be fabricated as well, this being the famous Gojo Ohashi Bridge. The bridge itself appears to not have existed at that time, and thus if this duel between the two really did occur, other locations in Kyoto where it more realistically would have taken place have been speculated over. Regardless though, returning to Benkei, it was said that upon seeing Yoshitsune crossing the bridge, and upon seeing the beautiful sword he wore at his waist, that Benkei decided to strike in aims to hopefully claim his final prize. Yoshitsune, however, jumping quickly out of harm's way, would continue to leap about the bridge, dodging Benkei's swings and eventually allowing him to get the better of the monstrous monk. Benkei was finally defeated. Yet, bitterly, it is believed that he may have tried a second time, a bit later, to once again claim Yoshitsune's sword. However, failing yet again, Benkei would see just how skilled and worthy this young samurai was, and would instead resolve to pledge himself to Yoshitsune as a warrior in his service. This is the point in Benkei's story where it appears he finally attained some form of larger purpose in his life. For so long, it seems as though he had been searching haphazardly for meaning. A freakish mountain of a figure with religious aspirations, but unable to truly find fulfillment, as his travels had all resulted in creating more chaos than good. But now from here, in service to Minamoto no Yoshitsune, his life took a drastic turn, and Benkei truly became the hero he was always destined to be. It does not appear to be known when this whole event is believed to have occurred, but soon enough, their story would come to reach the year 1180, the year in which the Gempei War would begin. It was here the scheming of the Taira in attempts to gain greater influence over the imperial court and even the emperor himself would lead to a general call for aid in the hopes of overthrowing their tyrannical rule. This would prompt the scattered Minamoto lords to emerge from their exile, rallying armies to their banners. Soon enough, Yoshitsune and Benkei would join up under that of Minamoto no Yoritomo, who had amassed a mighty force in the Kanto region. And it would be throughout the course of the war that the pair would become the conflict's greatest and most storied heroes, as Yoshitsune emerged as a brilliant commander, with Benkei as his powerful right-hand man. The two of them would come to foil each other perfectly, as the slender and tactful Yoshitsune was backed up by the sheer brawn of the mighty Benkei. Soon enough, they would come to win victory after victory. Together, they crushed the uprising of the rebel Minamoto lord, Minamoto no Yoshinaka, driving him from the capital and slaying him at Awazu, allowing them to then claim Kyoto for themselves after the Taira had been pushed out. From there, they would come to deal a devastating blow to their foes yet again at one of Yoshitsune's finest achievements, thrashing their numerically superior Taira enemy at Ichi-no-Tani. And finally, in the very end, they would see ultimate victory against the Taira in the last major battle of the war at Dan-no-ura, where battle was fought leaping from boat to boat, eventually resulting in the Taira being eradicated. No one could stop the legendary pair of Yoshitsune and Benkei, as heaps of accolades were continually draped upon them. Yet to say that Benkei was all muscle and no brain would be incorrect. Throughout the course of the war, Yoshitsune had greatly come to rely on Benkei for many purposes. Benkei was a well-learned figure after his religious training and his many travels. He continued to provide a great deal of insight to Yoshitsune and undertook religious rituals to aid in their favor. He did all this as a skilled and faithful servant to his lord, and one could make the argument that perhaps Yoshitsune may not have been able to achieve the full extent of the great success he did without Benkei at his side. And sadly, it was this great success which would in the end lead to their downfall. The Minamoto clan, led by Minamoto no Yoritomo, had won the war, and Yoritomo was of course destined to take up the title of shogun. However, it was his brother Yoshitsune who had actually paved the way to the Minamoto's victory through his glorious military victories over the Taira. Thus, suspicion and rumors of treason began to circle within Yoritomo's head regarding if Yoshitsune posed as a threat to overthrow him. Whether Yoshitsune actually did or didn't plan on doing such a thing is a bit more cloudy. The popular story paints Yoshitsune as the victim of Yoritomo's suspicion, but in reality there may be plenty of evidence that does indeed paint Yoshitsune as guilty of wanting to rise up as independent of his brother. But whatever the case, by 1189, Yoshitsune had eventually been stripped of his lands and titles and branded as an outlaw to be hunted down. Facing threat of attack, Yoshitsune was forced to flee the capital. It was here, accompanied by his loyal companion Benkei, a famous story has emerged about their attempt to sneak past an enemy border guard. This story is actually told in an obscure early Akira Kurosawa film, The Men Who Tread on the Tiger's Tail, which was released in 1952, a film I highly recommend checking out if you are able to. But it was here, Yoshitsune, Benkei, and a small group of loyal attendants all disguised themselves as monks on a task to receive donations, with Benkei obviously posing as their leader, being that he was likely the only real monk in the group. In an attempt to fool the guard captain, Benkei read from a fake document which explained their goal, and even chastised and beat Yoshitsune with a stick to further convince the guard captain they were legitimate. For it was unthinkable for a loyal retainer to ever lay a hand on his lord in such a way. Yet still somehow it is believed that the guard captain saw through their scheme and knew them to be Yoshitsune and Benkei. However, taken aback by Benkei's show of intense loyalty, even going so far as to strike his lord, the guard captain continued to pretend that he was unaware and even let them safely pass. They would eventually find shelter with another friendly lord of the Fujiwara family, where they stayed for a time, until after the lord's death, when they would then be betrayed by his son, who feared the wrath of the shogun. Besieged by a horde of hostile soldiers, Benkei made a final, valiant stand to defend his lord Yoshitsune. Holding firm on a bridge which led to the compound where Yoshitsune was, Benkei fought off wave after wave of attackers, casting them down before his great might. Even attacking him in groups, they were no match, as they were thrashed by sweeps of Benkei's naginata, cutting them down or knocking them from the bridge. Eventually, with no hope of dislodging him, they would resort to using bows. Still, Benkei held firm as a hail of arrows rained upon him. Now riddled with them, he stood defiant and motionless. However, this prompted soldiers to once again advance up to him, where they discovered that Benkei had at last been slain, still standing, holding the bridge for his lord. Benkei's standing death has gone down as one of the most heroic sacrifices in all of Japanese history, and in the end, it had given his lord Yoshitsune the time he needed to commit seppuku. The fantastical story of Benkei has continued to capture the imagination of countless individuals over the years, as I've mentioned, giving rise to all sorts of stories and plays centered around him and his great deeds. These no doubt even came to influence many samurai themselves, who held Benkei's characteristics as ideals to strive toward. To become an imposing figure of strength and resolute loyalty to the bitter end, to be able to die valiantly in defense of a noble and worthy cause. Although the story of Benkei might actually be myth, the legend he inspired was one that certainly did and continues to have real-world effects, as one of Japan's mightiest warriors, and certainly the greatest warrior monk of all time. If you enjoyed learning about the story of Benkei, don't forget to check out the other videos made in collaboration with this one here, as all the channels on screen now will be covering warrior monks this month. Links down below. And with that said, thank you for watching, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and ring that notification bell if you enjoyed this video and found it to be most informative.